Welcome back, everyone. My name is Shani Garcia. If you just joined a bit later today, we have had a terrific first session on business, and thank you very much for all the speakers and for Greg Duncan for chairing the first session. I'd like now to introduce the second session, and for that I will call and introduce Dr. Sabrina Lomax from the University of Sydney, who is a Senior Research Fellow on Animal Behavior and Welfare. Sabrina, I will leave the symposium to you.
Thank you, Yanni. And thanks everyone for joining us for the second session for today's symposium. This session is on society. So obviously in dairy farming, we're not in a bubble, and it's very much affected by consumers and their buying power and their perceptions. So our speakers today will be presenting on different aspects of society. It's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Professor Dan Weary. He's coming to us from the University of British Columbia, all the way over in Canada. Dan has co-founded the UBC's Animal Welfare Program, and he has a very, very large, extensive resume in the field of behavior and welfare with a focus on dairy. He's done a lot of work with calves particularly, and cow comfort, as well as other areas of health and welfare and production. Over to you, Dan. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Sabrina. What a pleasure to be here. And thanks very much to the organizers for the invitation to take part in this very interesting meeting. So let me just share my screen. Give me 1 second to get going here. And there we are. Okay. So yes, the title I've been asked to speak to is on producer and public attitudes and working together to maintain social license. And I guess in a way, for those of you that were able to join in the earlier session, if you think about the earlier sessions as maybe dealing more with sort of short to medium term risks and challenges, this is really asking us to think more about some of the longer term factors that I think can really actually threaten the existence of our entire industry, and are really important for those reasons to get right. But I think there are also issues that we don't talk enough about, and I'll come back to that right at the very end for some suggestions for how we could do a better job of talking more explicitly about our dream and our vision for the industry. To begin with, though, I'd like to just thank actually the Canadian dairy organizations that fund our group's research. I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't have been able to do any of the work I'm telling you about today without the support of our Canadian dairy farmers and the allied industries. And so I'm grateful for their financial and support and other support they've given over the years. Just so you guys know a little bit more about who I am and where I come from. This is our farm, our UBC farm near Vancouver, British Columbia. And this is the inside of our main barn, and it's a freestall barn. This barn, even though this is a university farm, looks very much like all of our neighbors' farms. And this is something that our Western Canadian producers are very proud of, that we have these we think really well designed and well managed indoor facilities. I know this is very different to the Australian system, but this is basically who I am and where we come from. And indeed, we're so proud of who we are, the research we do, but also the care that we take of our cows and of our facilities, that we show them off whenever we can. And so this is the outside of our main milking barn. And you can see right on the side door is a door labeled visitors. Each year we host thousands of visitors. Well, this is all pre-COVID-19, of course, so as of March, we haven't hosted anybody, but in a typical year, we host thousands of visitors and are really pleased and proud to show off our facilities and talk about dairying with them. We even do things like host open house events every year where we get people from all walks of life, and we tell them a little bit of our story, and we try to tell them at the same time a little bit about cows and about making milk. That said, it's not always rosy. So opening yourselves up to the public, or I guess maybe even more generally, in our industry, many of our producers felt sometimes under threat associated with negative perceptions of the dairy industry. One of our neighbors was, there was a video expose of some very bad practices actually happening at that farm. But this really shook the industry, and it really caused some inward looking by our farm, certainly, but also by all of our neighbors in terms of not only who we are as farmers, but also how we communicate and our how we represent ourselves, I guess, to the public, and how we engage with the public, and more generally this issue of social licensing. How do we ensure we still have an industry in 20 or 30 years from now? And so this talk is really about how do we maintain that social license, and I'm going to go through to start with a couple of approaches which I think are not particularly effective. One I call closing the barn doors. I know that it means more sense in this kind of environment where we have barns than in yours, but by that I simply mean sort of attempts to put up walls that keep people out. There's also this idea, I think, often that we see in ag that we can sort of educate our way out of it. We can, if only the public knew what we were doing and understood us better, then they would agree with what we're doing. And I'm going to argue that that also isn't a particularly effective way of moving forward. I'm going to concentrate more on the last two, which I think are more effective. And one is sort of trying to build ways of having substantive engagement with the public in terms of not only telling them what we do, but more importantly, I think, listening to them, to hear what they say and thinking really constructively on how we build on that feedback. And then I'm going to end on this idea about how do we actually move forward in terms of leading the process. I think sometimes, I know at least for us here in North America, in the dairy industry, we feel sort of this under threat by sort of the public and these critics that are telling us what to do. And I think there's a lot we could do by taking the leadership and really thinking carefully about what really are our core values, what are our dreams for where we want the industry to go, and articulating that dream, and then working together with other stakeholders to try to achieve it in a sustainable way. So that's what I'll try to end off with. Okay. Let's start off with closing the barn doors. I'm going to talk just as an example to show how one of the ways in which this is ineffective, one which is particularly relevant for us right now in Canada, because one of our provinces, actually our largest province, Ontario, is just in the midst of trying to pass an example of one of these ag-gag laws, which basically prohibit the taking or possessing of photographs and videos and audio recordings on farms without the owner's consent. And I said earlier how this is also a personal issue in British Columbia because there was this really nasty farm expose a few years back for us. The problem is that these kinds of attempts to sort of limit transparency are often perceived as that you have something to hide. And to show you how that works, I'm going to show you an experiment that one of our PhD students, Jesse Robbins, did, where he basically experimentally asked, what is the effect of knowing about these ag-gag laws on people's perceptions of farmers and specifically about trustworthiness and trustingness in farming and agriculture. So for this, Jesse used this crowdsourcing facility of Amazon Turk. He used about 700 American participants, and he did this panel of 12 different questions, all designed to get at trust. And basically what he took is those 700 random Americans were basically exposed to one or two treatments. In one of the treatments, they read a short blurb, which basically told them about these ag-gag laws. So we didn't use the word, of course, ag-gag. We used the word, we basically just described that the state you're living in is proposing legislation that will restrict the taking of videos, photographs, etc., like I showed in the previous slide. So that's what half the participants saw. The other half of the participants saw an exactly equivalently long and equivalently complex series of sentences, which told them about hay. So nothing relevant at all, right? It was just basically from the perspective here, just a control, just random. And they the participants had this opportunity to read these one or two blurbs, again, randomly assigned. And then they were asked these questions, which were to get at trust. And so here you see trust on the y-axis of the slide, and the most trusting individuals are scoring this +3, and the least trusting individuals are going to show -3. I'm going to show you a bunch of points. So as I said, there's 700 participants, okay? So you're going to see a cloud of points. And so here's the first cloud, and this is for people that read about hay. And the good news here is that, you know, people without any other prompting are actually, you know, more trusting than not of agriculture. And this corresponds well with other things we know about sort of the good opinion in general of farming and agriculture. The problem is that just reading that one paragraph on this proposal to institute ag-gag laws brings down that trust by almost a full point on this 7-point Likert scale. And so you might say, okay, what's 1 point really mean? Well, to give you a bit of context, this data is for omnivores, for people that eat meat and consume dairy products. Because we have so many participants, there's also a bunch of participants that were vegetarians. And you can see for those, the average of the vegetarian that just read about hay is about the same as the average for the omnivore that read about the ag-gag. So basically, you turn one of your ordinary omnivore participants into someone who has the attitudes of a vegetarian by telling them about the ag-gag laws. So sort of a sobering result. Just to give you some more specifics there, here's one question. You know, are farmers trustworthy sources of information? If they read about hay, they thought that about 65% of the participants thought farmers were trustworthy. This reduces to about 25% if you read about the ag-gag laws. A little bit more concerning is this question is, do you believe that farm animals have good lives? Remember, we haven't told them anything about the lives the farm animals live, right? The only thing they know is something about hay. For those, it's only about 40% that think farm animals have a good life. If you tell them about the ag-gag laws, it goes down to about 20%. So a bit of a sobering result, and something I think well worth considering if you think that by building better walls we're going to solve this problem of loss of trust. I would say that's exactly the wrong approach. Okay, well, what about this idea of trying to educate the public? Well, again, I'm going to show you the results of a little experiment, and I'm going to again, unfortunately, show you that it doesn't work. And so in this case, this is an experiment by another one of our PhD students, in this case, Beth Ventura. And as I told you earlier, we have this very open farm, so visitors come by all the time. Often though, these are like groups of visiting dairy farmers from the Netherlands or something like that. So they're people with an ag background. But sometimes we get people that are as green to agriculture. And our favorite event for that is this Vancouver Slow Food Tour. So these are people that are just basically interested in where their food comes from. So they're often sort of well, I mean, they often come by bicycles. You can see all these bicycles out front, for example. So these are people that are coming up from the city for a day out in farm country with their bikes, and they stop by our farm, and it's, for many of them, it's the first dairy farm they've been on. And so Beth had the idea, well, what if you took a group like that and you told them a little bit about our farm, which I said we're very proud of, we think we've got a very good farm. Couldn't we use that as a way of getting these people to be more supportive of agriculture, more supportive and positive about what we do? So that was Beth's hypothesis. So what Beth did very simply is she brought all these people in. As they arrived on their bicycles, she went out and said hello, and she asked them if they're willing to participate in this, short questionnaire. And she asked them, this first question is, how confident are you that dairy cattle have a good life? Now remember, these are people just getting off the bike. They haven't seen the farm yet, right? And you get this sort of nice little diagram here, little pie chart, and you can see the good news is that most of the people are pretty confident that the cows have a good life, about 42%. Right? So more than anything else. That's good. Then we take them on this wonderful tour around the farm. We show them all of our state of our facilities, our beautiful cows, etc. And then Beth brings them in again and asks them exactly the same question. And what do you find? People are less confident. So all that work in this first exposure to agriculture, and what it seems is you've really made people less confident in this idea that cows have a good life. And so Beth also asked these people, of course, a series of more detailed questions to try to find out what's going on. And she learned a couple of interesting things there. One is that some perceptions did improve after visiting our farm. Now, remember I said earlier that we had this nasty video expose of a neighbor's farm, and this made people quite worried about the humane treatment of animals. And what they found when they came, and so here you have somebody who says, I'm concerned about humane treatment, about cramped living conditions. But after they see our cows on our farm, they say the animals seem very well cared for. The practices seem very ethical. So there's a good news, right? Okay, but there's also people that really haven't thought very much about farming at all. So here's one individual, actually a very typical response, that said, never really thought about it. I've never had any concerns. After they do this tour, they come back and say, oh, gee, I'd prefer to see the cows grazing in the fields, eating grass, and the calves not separated so quickly from their mothers. So this is, again, very typical response for people that come in and see our farm, but for the first time. So take home on this is that engaging, educating the public probably won't work. So what about a more substantive process of really trying to engage with the public, of really trying to work with them, shall we say? And on that aspect, I want to give a couple different examples. So to begin with, I do want to say that there can be some value of just sharing our good news stories, about showing the really cool things, I think, that we do and the relationships we have with our cows. And so here's an example. It's really, I mean, it's showing something that we did, but I think it shows the power of getting out a good news story. And this is some research we did recently on basically the cow's motivation to access one of these wonderful mechanical brushes, which cows love. And we did a study basically showing that cows love to brush. And so here, a little bit of scientific methodology for you. We set it up, there's this gate, and the cows learned to push on this gate. And basically, what the researcher involved did is basically would add weight to this gate to make it harder and harder for the cows to push. And she found that the cows would push a very high weight indeed to get access to the brush. So here's a cow, she comes up, and she pushes on the gate, and then she pushes her way through, and then she goes, she enjoys that beautiful brush, right? So you can imagine we shared this video. So for example, had it up on our social media, and people love watching cows with a brush. And indeed, when the paper came out, the story really sort of took off. And so here's a tweet that I love. For those of you that aren't fluent in Dutch, it basically says something like, cows are willing to brush or motivated to brush, researchers have found, and this points the way to more cow-friendly practices, basically. What I think is important about this tweet is it was the 9th highest trending tweet on Twitter in the Netherlands at the time. So people just loved, partly I think because it took them to the link to this video. So people loved hearing the story about the cows with the brushes and seeing the cows engage in this positive way. So good news story. That said, I think often we tend to stop our thinking there. We think if we, again, it comes back to sort of education. In this case, it's almost more sort of positive advertising. If we tell a good story, then everybody will be happy and the problem will go away. I think that's a beginning, but it's only just a beginning. We really need to also create a more substantive process of engagement. So here's a slide I showed you earlier of our students actually engaging with people that come on the farm in one of our open houses. And here, yeah, we're telling our story about our cows and about what we do, but we're also listening to what they say. And, exactly listening to the kinds of things I showed you in that earlier slide about people come back and say, oh yeah, this is nice, but why aren't your cows outside? Or why are you taking the cows away from their mom? And I think those questions, we need to be aware that we don't just give sort of these pat answers that, that our dairy association tells us to say, or that grandpa said, and that we actually take these really to heart and really think about these and reflect upon these questions and then think about how we could address those better. So it actually suggests a process like this where we do this engagement, yes, but we use that as a way of really prompting a period of reflection in us. And so, for example, we've now done 20 years of research in terms of how to better incorporate pasture in our intensive North American setting. We've also done 20 years of research in terms of how to improve calf care, including some work around keeping cows and calves together. So that's sort of prompting our research very much, these kinds of comments. Then I think, though, that it's this ongoing process. We need to come up with things which we think would work, but then we need to show those again to people. We need to have this ongoing conversation with essentially our community to make sure that what we do stays in line with their expectations. Okay, these are things that you can do. You can get out your good news stories. You can again, post-COVID, open up your farms, or maybe virtually open up your farms to discussion and interaction with your neighbors and your customers. But I think there's also things we can do as an industry that sort of take the problem more seriously, or more of a focused approach. And here's one example of a research project that we did, where we tried to get at, in a systematic way, what are some of these public views around dairying, and how do we make dairying better? And so here we asked the question of the public: what do you consider to be an ideal dairy farm, and why are these characteristics important to you? Again, we asked a large sample of American participants this question, and what the participants came back, I could show you many graphs if you wanted this, but instead I've condensed this into one beautiful picture, which basically tells the story. This is what people want. They want cows outside in sunshine, want cows and calves together, et cetera, et cetera. So we see all sorts of comments from participants when you ask them this kind of question about what do they consider the ideal farm. A lot of it comes back to the cow and the care of that cow. And so, for example, a lot of people make the comments that cows should have access to pasture. This is an interesting, this may seem normal for you in Australia. Remember, this is North American participants, where very few of the lactating cows are out on pasture. Interesting, though, is that the consumers bring up these kinds of cow issues, but they also bring up other issues which suggest an understanding of the system. One is they bring up issues about the milk itself, of course, so very interested that cows aren't provided hormones. This, of course, suggests the risks associated with some of our estrus synchronization protocols. But also they bring up aspects about the business and how the business is run. So I think that's refreshing too. So here's a comment, for example, that people think an ideal farm is one that shows character and inspires confidence in the business. So hopefully in these examples, I've pointed out some ways in which we can positively engage. But I think that the key aspect there is that we're not just telling our story. We are maybe first and foremost listening respectfully, and really trying to understand what people are telling us, what our neighbors and colleagues and customers are telling us, and trying to incorporate that into the way we do our business. Okay, that's great, but at least for me anyways, I feel that this also leaves me the sense that, okay, I'm going to be a better listener, but it's a little bit disempowering. And I think that we could also be more effective and also have a better sense of our own control of the situation if we try to begin to lead that process. And the issue with leading the process, though, is that we need to really begin by having a vision for our industry. We need to be able to essentially articulate our core values and say what is the industry what is the dairy farm that we want in the future? So we ask that question of the general public, but really I think that's a question that's really important for us to start asking ourselves. And I know, at least now, again, I'm assuming that you Australians are way more progressive and open than us North Americans in these respects. But I know when I get together with a group of dairy farmers, they'll talk about the weather and maybe maybe corn prices and maybe about the new barn they'll build or the new tractor they'll buy. But I've never in my 25 years of working with dairy farmers have I had somebody come up and say, "Now, Dan, tell me about your dreams and aspirations for the dairy industry." So I think that's a hard, to be honest, I think it's a hard conversation to have. It requires a certain vulnerability, and it requires us sort of looking in and thinking about, how we could do, in a very long-term perspective, how we could do our jobs better. So we've tried to help that conversation along in a number of different ways. And one thing which we've been trying to do at recent meetings, basically when I get asked to give a presentation to a group of dairy farmers, what I'll often ask them to do is tell me their vision for the future. And that can be even a hard thing to ask, or a hard thing to get people thinking about. So one trick that I do is I say, okay, imagine if you have grandchildren, or if you want to have grandchildren, that you hope that your granddaughter or grandson is going to take over that farm in 20, 25 years time. Well, what do you think that farm needs to look like for that to be an attractive proposition for your grandson or daughter? And what does that farm have to look like so that it'll still be around in 25 years, so it'll still be acceptable to your neighbors in that community and to your customers? And that's worked in terms of really spawning some really interesting conversations. So I don't have time to get into great detail on all the responses we've got back from that, but I'm going to show you an example of a word cloud. So this basically just shows the larger words are the words that come up more frequently. And this is a word cloud from a group of farmers in Red Deer, Alberta. So Red Deer is right in the heart of farm country in Alberta, halfway between Edmonton and Calgary, for those who know their Canadian geography. But it's a very sort of traditional ag town. And it's a group of farmers, and they just started talking about this. And these are the words they wrote down. And these are words about what they wanted, but also sometimes words of things that they didn't want to have in the industry anymore. And you can see, this is, to me, was sort of shocking, the kinds of things they came up with. Local. Transparency, of course, we talked about. They didn't want to have factory farms. They didn't want to see that word. They wanted high levels of biosecurity. That makes a lot of sense nowadays. They wanted pasture, even though the vast majority of them weren't doing it. They wanted cows outdoors again. They also thought that some use of technology was very positive. They talked very positively about robots and automation. They talked negatively about tie stalls and about drug use. So a bunch of really interesting things comes up, I think, when you have these conversations that begins to develop a little bit of an articulation of where it is we want our industry to go. Tough work, but I think really worthwhile. It's not enough, of course, just to ask what our sort of dreams of and our values are, but we also have to begin to think about, okay, how are we going to implement that? How are we going to get from here so that our granddaughter really wants to take over that farm in 25 years? So we run out of those 25 years pretty quick. And so we've also asked that question. Here's some responses from a recent conversation I had with a group of pig farmers and pig industry types, asking them, how do we achieve our vision for basically the ideal pig farm of the future in this case, but I think it applies to dairy equally. So here's some of the responses from those pig industry types. They said we need to have openness to change. They really want it to be industry led, which I agree with. They said we need to sit down and decide what our values are. No kidding, that's exactly what we need to do. Share lessons within our industry. They said we need engagement with consumers in the industry. They wanted research to pave the way, and they also thought there was room for minimum standards and enforcement. So a number of interesting issues that come out of these kinds of conversations. Again, sort of 1 hour or 90-minute conversations with groups of producers. Okay, take-home points for you. First of all, don't even think about this closing the barn door. Secrecy isn't going to get to where we want. All it does is erodes trust, and we need that trust. If you want, spend money on these one-way educational efforts. I mean, our own dairy industry is doing that right now in a series of ads. I know it makes us, people within the industry, feel good about our industry, but it isn't going to get where we want in terms of building social license. Sustained two-way engagement can get us there, but it's hard work, and you have to invest in a number of different ways, as I said, including this aspect of sort of humbly listening and reflecting on what people say. But I think most importantly, we need to think about ways in which we could lead this process by developing a collective vision and a plan for how to achieve this. And on that point, what I'll ask you to do, if I can, is just as you're thinking to write in maybe the comments or the question and answer bit, just give us some of your words of what you think your dreams are for the future of dairy, and how do we begin to achieve that? I'd be really interested in seeing your perspectives on that. Thanks very much, and thanks again to the organizers for the opportunity to do this.
Thank you, Dan. That was an excellent presentation. Covered a lot of the key issues, so I think there's a lot of talking points there. Just a reminder for everyone to pop their questions in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end to go through those. Our next speaker today